Hello and welcome to Wednesday in Parliament. Our look at the best of the day in the Commons and the Lords. So how are we going to leave the European Union? The party leaders clash again over Brexit.
But the devolved governments don't know the plan, businesses don't know the plan, Parliament doesn't know the plan.
It's this government that is listening to the voice of the British people.
Also on this programme, the firm employed to root out fraud in the tax credit system comes in for criticism by MPs.
This is about the duty of the government to preserve justice being abandoned by the profit motive this contract provided.
But first, it's a shambolic Tory Brexit, the phrase of the Labour leader Jeremy Corbyn, when Prime Minister's questions returned to the subject of Britain's EU departure. Mr Corbyn said it was time Theresa May gave some clarity over the government's plans. Meanwhile, the Prime Minister accused him of trying to frustrate the will of the British people expressed in the June referendum. First, the Labour leader quoted the remarks of the First Minister of Wales, remarks that followed Monday's Downing Street meeting between Theresa May and the leaders of all the UK devolved assemblies.
The First Minister for Wales, Carwyn Jones, said there is a great deal of uncertainty, but they are clear they need full and unfettered access to the single market. Can the Prime Minister help the First Minister of Wales and indeed the other devolved administrations by giving them some clarity?
In relation to the issue of clarity on the aims that the government has in relation to Brexit, I have been very clear and I will be clear again. There are those who talk about means and those who talk about ends. I'm talking about ends. What we want to see is the best possible arrangement for trade with and operation within the single European market for businesses in goods and services here in the United Kingdom.
Jeremy Corbyn! I thought for a moment the Prime Minister was going to say Brexit means Brexit again. There are others... I'm sure she'll tell us one day what it actually means. The Mayor of London also added this is causing unnecessary certainty, but it's also very important. Uncertainty. Mr. Speaker, it would be also very helpful if the Prime Minister could provide some clarity over the Northern Ireland border. Will we continue membership of the Customs Union, or are we going to see border checks introduced between Northern Ireland and the Republic?
The Leader of the Opposition tries to poke fun at the phrase of Brexit means Brexit, but the whole point is this. Brexit, it's this government that is listening to the voice of the British people. What the Brexit means Brexit, that means we're coming out of the European Union. What the Right Honourable Gentleman tries to be doing is frustrating the will of the British people by saying that Brexit means something completely different. Now, in relation to the Northern Irish border, a considerable amount of work was already going on with taking place with the Irish government to look at the issues around the common travel area. That work is continuing. We have been very clear, the government of the Republic of Ireland have been very clear, the Northern Ireland Executive has been very clear that none of us want to see a return to the borders of the past.
Every day the Prime Minister dithers over this chaotic Brexit, employers delay investment, and there are rumours circulating about relocation. This cannot carry on until March of next year. When is the Prime Minister going to come up with a plan?
I want this country to be a global leader in free trade. The Labour Party is against free trade. I want to introduce control on free movement so that we have an end of free movement. The Labour Party wants to continue with free movement. I want to deliver on the will of the British people. He is trying to frustrate the will of the British people.
Well, Mr. Speaker, there was no answer on the border, which was the question. And on Monday, Mr. Speaker, the Prime Minister told the House, and I quote, "We have a plan which is not to set out at every stage of the negotiation the details." I've been thinking about this for a couple of days, Mr. Speaker, and I think when you're searching for the real meaning behind and the importance behind the Prime Minister's statement, you have to consult the great philosophers. The only one I can come up with.
Mr. Cleverly, calm yourself. You're imperiling your own health, man, which is a source of great concern to me. Jeremy Corbyn.
All I can come up with, Mr. Speaker, is Baldrick, who says our cunning plan is to have no plan. Brexit was apparently about taking back control. But the devolved governments don't know the plan, businesses don't know the plan, Parliament doesn't know the plan. When will the Prime Minister abandon this shambolic Tory Brexit and develop a plan that delivers for the whole country?
We're going to deliver the best possible deal for trade in goods and services, both with and operation within the European Union. And we're going to deliver an end to free movement. That's what the British people want, and that's what this government's going to deliver for them.
The Prime Minister's real plan for Brexit seems to be to pick winners, to cut a special deal for the City of London, to let the bankers avoid the dire consequences of leaving the economic union. Wales has an exporting economy with a £5 billion trade surplus last year and 200,000 jobs dependent on trade with the European Union. A soft Brexit for her friends in the city, a hard Brexit for everyone else. Will she cut a similar deal for Wales?
I will be cutting the best deal for the United Kingdom, all parts of it.
Russia has withdrawn a request to refuel a naval flotilla at a Spanish port in North Africa. A battle group has been sailing for the past week from Russia, and Spain had been facing pressure from its NATO partners to refuse access to the port because of concerns that the Russian warships could take part in attacks on the beleaguered Syrian city of Aleppo. At Prime Minister's questions, the SNP's Westminster leader Angus Robertson called Syria one of the biggest humanitarian catastrophes of our time. He said he expected the latest ceasefire in Aleppo would end shortly.
Will the Prime Minister tell us what efforts the UK is currently undertaking to support a peaceful resolution to the conflict, but also to deal with those who are exacerbating the situation?
My right honourable friend, the Foreign Secretary, has been involved in discussions with the United States Secretary of State, Senator Kerry, about these Secretary of State Kerry about these particular issues, looking for that way forward. I raised the issue of Russian actions in Syria, particularly the bombing of Aleppo, at the European Union Council at the end of last week. It was only on the agenda because the UK had raised it, and as a result of that discussion, the EU agreed that should the atrocities continue, then we will look at all available options for taking action to put pressure on Russia to stop their indiscriminate bombing of innocent civilians.
In recent years, more than 60 Russian naval vessels have refuelled and resupplied in Spanish ports. Whoa. So will the Prime Minister join me and EU and NATO allies in unequivocally calling on Spain to refuse the refuelling?
Yeah. What we have seen, sadly, is that the Russians are already able to unleash attacks on innocent civilians in Syria. What matters is that we put pressure on Russia to do what everybody agrees is the only way that we are going to resolve this issue, which is to ensure that we have a political transition in Syria, and that's where we should focus our attention.
Theresa May. Well, later at Prime Minister's question time, the Prime Minister faced an accusation that the government had broken its promise over the provision of adequate mental health services. The Labour MP Luciana Berger said half of all clinical commissioning groups, or CCGs in England, were having to reduce the amounts they spend on mental health services. That claim came after another Labour MP had raised the tragic case of one of his relatives.
Mr. Speaker, last year my 25-year-old nephew Matty committed suicide after a very short period of depression. His GP had referred him for talking therapy counselling, but warned him it'd be at least 6 months before he got an appointment. Mr. Speaker, these treatments in the NHS are very often a waiting game and a dangerous waiting game and a postcode lottery. What's the Prime Minister doing to sort this crisis out?
Can I first of all recognise and commend the honourable gentleman for raising the personal experience that he has of the terrible tragedy that can occur when mental health problems are not properly dealt with. He raises a very serious issue, and it's a serious issue for everybody in this House, on how the NHS treats mental health. It's why we have established this concept of parity of esteem for mental health and physical health in the National Health Service. It's why we are seeing record levels of funding.
Mr. Speaker, the Prime Minister just told us that there are record levels of spending going into our mental health services. Her Health Secretary stood at that dispatch box on the 9th of December and told us that the proportion of funding going into mental health from every one of our CCGs should be increasing. Why is it then that 57% of CCGs in our country are reducing the proportion of spend in mental health? Yet another broken promise. When will we have real equality for mental health in our country?
Well, the fact that I set out that we're spending record levels in the NHS on mental health is absolutely right. But I have said in response to a number of people who've questioned on this that we recognise that there is more for us to do in mental health, and I would have thought that we should have cross-party support on doing just that.
Theresa May. At the start of the month, Jeremy Hunt pledged that the NHS in England would be self-sufficient in doctors after the UK leaves the European Union. The Health Secretary promised that medical schools in the UK would be allowed to offer up to 1,500 extra training places a year. Mr Hunt questioned whether Britain should continue to import doctors from poorer countries while turning away domestic graduates keen to study medicine. In the House of Lords, a Conservative peer said he was pleased with the Health Secretary's new approach, but he said the problem went deeper.
Today, 56% of the intake of medical students is female. Furthermore, 70% of female GPs today work part-time, and a recent survey from the King's Fund says that 90% of all medical students in training want to work part-time. And given it costs $200,000 to train anybody as a medical practitioner, surely the time has come to consider a minimum full-time commitment of at least 4 years after qualification, similar to what they do in Singapore and indeed in our own armed forces.
My noble friend is absolutely right that over 55% of men and women who go to medical school are now women, and I think that is a fantastic change that's happened over the last 20 years. And it is true that more women than men tend to work part-time as they have children and bring up their children, and that is taken into account in the planning done by HEE. When my right honourable friend, the Health Secretary, made his announcement, he said that we would be looking in our consultation at requiring people to whom we have paid to go through medical school to give at least 4 years back to the NHS, which I think is reasonable. The figure is actually 6 years if you become an army doctor, so I think 4 years is not unreasonable.
Is the noble Lord the Minister aware that whilst there may be enough people wanting to apply to medical school, many of the brightest and the best are now completely turned away from doing medicine because of the relationship with the Secretary of State for Health? This is a very serious mistrust, and whether they're male or female, the brightest and best are often not applying, and there is an increasing evidence of this in most medical schools and indeed in schools as well.
You're watching our roundup of the day in the Commons and the Lords. Still to come, in the post-Brexit world, do we need a new royal yacht? MPs have turned their fire on the government over the management of its contract with Concentrix. Her Majesty's Revenue and Customs employed the American firm to root out fraud and error in the tax credit system. But Concentrix has made some surprising mistakes, leaving thousands of people short of money after their benefits were stopped on the basis of flawed information. Last month, HMRC stepped in to review cases previously dealt with by Concentrix. The firm has also been told that its contract will not be renewed. Labour is calling on the government to investigate what went wrong, and many MPs shared examples of errors faced by their constituents.
I was contacted not so long ago by a woman in a similar situation. She had been accused by Concentrics of, she'd had her tax credits cut because they accused her of having a lesbian relationship with her sister. And it took her coming to the Member of Parliament and myself calling Concentrics myself before they started to believe the truth. Isn't it absurd that it takes a direct intervention from a Member of Parliament before this ridiculous company takes these people seriously?
I thank my honourable member for his comments, and the term "it beggars belief" springs to mind, and unfortunately his case is not an isolated one. There is an ever-growing evidence base suggesting that Concentrics has been unfairly and unjustly stopping people's tax credits, leaving them in financial difficulty, along with the anxiety that causes.
She questioned whether payment by results was the right kind of contract and whether the government had monitored the impact on claimants.
It wasn't simply a case of slapping Concentrics on the back of the hand and then let's all move on. This is about the duty of the government to preserve justice being abandoned by the profit motive this contract provided. The risks here were real human risks, families forced into destitution, anguish, despair, and all of the associated pressures on an individual's mental health.
Over the last few months, it's become clear that despite the best efforts of the majority of its frontline staff, Concentrics was failing to meet the standards we expected and indeed had specified in their contract. And this meant that many of those people, the people we've been hearing about in the Honourable Lady's speech and in interventions so far, people like my constituents whose tax credits were being investigated, have been caused needless frustration and distress when it came to resolving their cases.
She said HMRC staff were now reviewing cases initially considered by Concentrics.
Anyone who wishes to challenge any changes made to their tax credits has a right to request a mandatory reconsideration of their case. As of the start of this week, HMRC had received over 26,000 such requests, and staff have already reviewed and resolved over 3/4 of those and are up to date with these Concentrics reviews. Now, as I say, that means resolved in accordance with the facts. It doesn't necessarily mean that there was a problem in each case.
I've had 2 Concentrics cases from single mothers, one of whom was required to disprove a relationship she plainly never had with the former tenant of her house, evidence she couldn't possibly provide. But would my right honourable friend agree that the important thing now is that this contract with Concentrics has been ended, that a system for investigating mistakes has been put in place, and that a hardship fund has been put in place? That's what's important going forward.
I wouldn't agree with all the points being made, but there has been much fair comment, and as I say, for that reason, we won't oppose this motion today. We want, above all, to get a fair outcome for everyone affected, and we want to learn important lessons to make sure that we can ensure this sort of thing doesn't happen again, and that we as I say, learn lessons from the situation.
Mary Black recounted her favourite error by Concentrics.
R.S. McCall is a corner shop in Scotland that is as common as a W.H. Smith is in England. And yet people were being accused of living with this mysterious Mr McCall because their flat was above an R.S. McCall shop. And at no point did anyone in Concentrics or HMRC think, wait a minute, this Casanova's getting about a bit. At no point. This would almost be very funny. This would be funny until you remember that this is actually people's lives that we're talking about. This is their survival that we're talking about. We have to now legislate so that this is never allowed to happen again. I think the government has to bring this kind of thing back in-house, because it's got to be back into the day-to-day responsibility of government. You can't say to a private company, we want you to make £1 billion worth of cuts, but we're only going to pay you on a results basis. Yeah. That is a recipe for disaster.
MPs have been hearing from the International Trade Secretary, Liam Fox, about the landmark European trade deal with Canada, which was rejected by Belgium's Wallonia region. That rejection meant it couldn't go ahead, despite the support of the rest of the EU, including the UK. At Westminster, the European Scrutiny Committee was particularly interested in why the UK had backed the deal without the say-so of Parliament.
Can you appreciate why so many people who are not necessarily against this deal, they're just a bit concerned about it, find it hard to understand why something that's taken 7 years to this stage couldn't be kept waiting for another 2 or 3 weeks to allow a 2-hour debate in the House of Commons so that Parliament could decide whether or not it was a good deal rather than the government?
Yeah, the different trade agreements have been negotiated in very different times. This has been a very long one, despite the fact, as the Commissioner said, if you can't do a trade deal with Canada, who can you do a trade deal with? And I think it does point out the difficulty of doing a trade deal with a very large number of partners, with all the complications that brings, both at a national and, as we've discovered, a subnational level. It's still our hope that we can do that. It's worth pointing out that NAFTA was agreed in about 14 months. It is possible to bring trade deals to fruition in a much shorter time when, first of all, there is very high-level energy applied to that, and also when there's a clear agreement on what the common ground is between the partners.
With respect, Secretary of State, you haven't actually answered the main point of my question, which is, how do you explain to the 17 million people, not including myself, who voted to leave because they wanted to restore parliamentary sovereignty, as they saw it, and a deal that's taken so long to get to this stage, it couldn't be held up for another few weeks to allow parliamentary sovereignty to be exercised? Not for me, because I didn't vote to leave. How do you explain it to 17 million people who thought that by voting to leave they were going to enhance parliamentary democracy, when a 3-week delay is going to scupper a deal that's taken 7 years to get here?
We haven't left yet.
Peter Grant then moved on to TTIP, a trade deal between the EU and the United States.
You'll be aware that one of your predecessors in the government, Anna Soubry, in the House of Commons on the 10th of December 2015, gave an assurance to the Chamber about TTIP. They said it's not a secret negotiation, it's there for everybody to read on the internet. Well, clearly it wasn't all there for everybody to read. When it is concluded, it will be for this Chamber to ratify it. Would you not accept that those words may now be seen by some as being in bad faith, given that a very similar agreement with Canada rather than with the US has been significantly endorsed without having come anywhere near the Chamber and the House of Commons?
Well, she was referring to TTIP, and we, as you correctly say, have the TTIP reading room and the ability for members to get access to classified documents, which, incidentally, we point out is already afforded to MEPs, which is why I think it's something that should be afforded to MPs as well. So I think that I don't think she can be taken as being in bad faith when what she promised was ultimately carried out in terms of the ability.
So it was important that this should happen for TTIP, but it didn't matter to apply the same standard of scrutiny to
Well,
CETA.
we're at a very different stage. In terms of TTIP, these negotiations are still fully underway. I think it actually is helpful that we've got a process now where MPs are able to scrutinise it more than we've been able to do in previous agreements, including CETA. I hope that's an advance that we build upon. I hope it is a precedent that we will use for further agreements. It's certainly one that, as Trade Secretary, I would like to see as a precedent for any future agreements, whether still inside the European Union or beyond our membership of the European Union.
Is it fair to say that CETA is at so much of a different stage that for significant parts of CETA it's now too late? That even if Parliament resolves not to support it for some reason, that the parts that were within ministerial discretion to agree or not to agree at the EU Council, that those horses have gone, and that at best we can only close the stable door and keep some of the horses back?
Well, we still have the ability to reject the entire CETA treaty should Parliament wish to do so. That is the ultimate power that Parliament has, and it's right that it's so.
The government has again ruled out plans to commission a new royal yacht to help the UK win trade deals as the country heads out of the EU. The royal yacht Britannia was taken out of service soon after Tony Blair's government won power in 1997. No replacement was built. Britannia had clocked up 1 million miles around the globe in her 44-year career. The price of a new royal yacht has been put at £120 million. A Conservative member of the House of Lords spoke up for the concept.
When I was Secretary of State, I hosted a dinner on the Royal Yacht in Toronto, and we asked the top industrialists who flew thousands of miles to be there. I didn't think they were coming to see me. Now, given that more than 100 backbench Conservative MPs, the present Foreign Secretary and the past Foreign Secretary have all expressed support for a privately funded royal yacht, will my noble friend not at least agree to spend the money raised by the Telegraph, the Daily Telegraph, on having a privately funded cost-benefit analysis? What possible objection could there be to that and for the government giving its full support?
My Lords, I'm sure my noble friend underestimates his pulling power. I can say to him that if private enterprise, however defined, believes that there is a business case for a new royal yacht, we would, of course, look at that. But we would still be left with the question of who would pay for the vessel. Given that no government department has a need for a royal yacht, it's hard to see how any public funding could be justified.
And that's it for this programme. Do join me for our next Daily Roundup. Until then, from me, Keith McDougall, goodbye.